Hi, this is Dr. Ashok Bhattacharya from the Empathy Clinic here in Oakville, and this is our show First Name Basis. Today, I have the absolute pleasure of bringing three new guests on the show. We have Ronnie, Ajit, and Emily. Let's start with Ronnie.
Sure. My name is Ronnie Gyani. I'm based here in New York City. I'm an investor, a philanthropist, a financial professional, and been very much in tune with starting my own podcast called Fear is a Liar over the last year and posting a lot on LinkedIn about what's important to me. And I'm really excited to be here with all of you and talk about empathy and how it relates to covering.
Thank you, Ashok. Really appreciate the invitation. My name is Ajit Dodani. I'm an empathy strategist by profession, and at Empathify You, we help leaders and organizations use empathy as a superpower to create cultural change, increase productivity, and increase organizational growth. So super excited to be with you here and all of you.
Thank you. And Emily, tell us a bit about you.
Well, if you can't see the resemblance, I'm Dr. Bhattacharya's daughter. I work in the technical space, software technical space, and I'm a customer success manager. So really what that is learning how to bring empathy into the client space and how do we build those lasting relationships so that we can maintain business and really have a great partnership.
I'm a psychiatrist, I'm a therapist. I spend my entire day talking about empathy and using empathy as a tool for diagnosis as well as for treatment. So I think we're all interested in the customer experience, the client experience, and in order to amplify the quality of experience that they have moving forward. But today's topic, we're going to talk about a word called covering. I'd like to hear what the group thinks about that word covering.
So covering is a concept that actually has been made famous and relevant in the corporate world by Kenji Yoshino from Yale. Covering is a strategy that people use to cover known and stigmatized behavior, features, physical features, in order to almost appease the person in power and fit in and succeed in an environment, in a workplace. In this,
Hiding a significant part of yourself.
One hesitation I have about covering, understanding covering is this a temporary kind of mask that you put on, or is it something that becomes long-term and therefore it's covering?
The essence of it is the person feels that some aspect of themselves or many aspects of themselves are unacceptable in the situation that they're in. And because it's unacceptable, they have the choice of either exposing it and exposing whatever beliefs they think they're going to be treated, or hiding it. And it might be more common for people to cover when they're not in a position of power.
Right. So there are two types of covering. There's covering that's self-imposed, that we put on ourselves. And then there's what's called covering that's demanded almost. And people in power demand the covering. A new employee joins an organization, a coworker goes out to coffee with her and says, "Hey, good to have you here. You know, you'd do really well if you changed your name to this and you didn't wear that hair cover of yours. You'd do really well here." So she's not the person in power. She's not her manager. But the reason why she has in that moment a position of power is because she's been there longer. Very subtly tells her, maybe it's best you cover. Oh, and by the way, my real name is this, and I've changed it to this.
Coming from the corporate world, I feel like this happens every day, no matter what. This is like live and center. It's all about how amplified it is and how much it's actually happening. And then also how large the organization is, because generally the larger the organization, in my experience, the more covering that's happening. And I think it boils on also to the culture. If the culture is a certain way, that then flows into everyone covering in their own way and or demanding that covering. I'll give you a perfect example. So my real name that none of you guys really know, is completely opposite of Ronnie. It is not Ronnie. It doesn't say that on any of my official documents, right? So believe it or not, my name is Gunwarjeet. I actually grew up going to school being very ashamed of that name because it was so different than anybody I knew in class, even fellow folks who were of the same culture as me, right? So I still remember going up to the teachers when there was a new teacher or a substitute, asking them to please not say my name on attendance because of how
Wow.
embarrassed I would be of that name, right? Because it just made me so different, right? And I didn't really have people saying that's okay, that that's different, that that's actually, there's meaning behind it, there's culture behind it, and you may want to be proud of it, actually, right? So that discussion never came up or whatever, but nonetheless, that then amplified throughout my work career when I started in my internships and I went up the corporate ladder. I made sure that that name was not on anything because I came from humble beginnings, in my opinion. And for them to then see that name in this corporate environment where I had the blessing and privilege to continue to succeed, I was absolutely covering. And now that I reflect on it, I wish I hadn't, but it's just something that I'm bringing to my awareness now. That's actually something to celebrate rather than cover up. But I didn't feel like it would be welcomed, you know? And I still feel like in the majority of companies, it wouldn't necessarily be welcomed even today. But except I wouldn't be willing to cover it today. You know, I feel very differently about it now.
I wonder if it's possible to almost just want to fit in and mistake that for like just this innocent kind of, I want to fit in, and then you're accidentally covering, and then years pass by and you're in a situation like yourself, Ronnie.
Oh yeah.
I,
Where it becomes who you are, right? It becomes
exactly.
Yeah, completely. And then also, when you see other people that may have the name of, I don't know, Jatinder, and then they go by James, and you know that they go by James, and no one's necessarily talking about that. No one's mentioning that. They're gonna then do the same thing. So then that then evolves into a culture of a company, let's say, or a workplace, or what have you. And
Absolutely.
exactly what it is, right? And then there's other situations that I'm sure you can give some great examples where you start covering in many other ways because you're already covering, and then you have other examples of, well, I'd rather fit in rather than stand out, right?
When it was time to have our children, I felt very, very strongly about not giving my children Indian names. We finally considered Emily because it was such a classic, easy to relate to. And unfortunately, the year we called her Emily was the commonest girl's name in North America that year. So when we went to the playground and I said, Emily, about 10 heads look up, and because they're all Emilys out there. So, I mean, Emily, do you wish you had a different name?
No, I think it's hard to retroactively look back and say, because I feel like I'm Emily, that's my name. So it would be a strange thought for me to have. However, I've been simplifying my last name for years just because it's easier to just change it to 3 letters or say it's something else, or just call me Emily, because it is very complicated and it opens a conversation that you don't always want to have.
Is that our names are meaningful to us, but they may not fit into the culture that we're in. And it might actually, but we may think it won't. And so we make these adaptations and these accommodations. And laterally, we think, wow, why did I do that?
It's easier to be who you are when who you are is all around you. But when you are not what's all around you, it takes a lot of physical and mental courage. Sometimes it's easier to cover and embrace what's accepted and portrayed. And for years, if you look at the minority community, we have sometimes created a white-facing front for our lives, for our homes also. Certain areas of our home are very, very accepting, very receiving, and then our personal narratives and stories are told in rooms that are not front-facing. I realize that we cannot be victims. We have to understand, what have we done as immigrants sometimes. Today, the world is united at a level, financially, economically, socially, that I am doing business around the world every day. And it is my responsibility to show up as my fullest self. Because, Ashok, when you say Ajit to me, every time you say the word Ajit, for me, you're telling me, Mr. Invincible. Invincible, that's what my name means, invincible. So if you ask me, and which I did, just like Ronnie, at one point in my life, made it an abbreviated, almost anglicized name, I was doing myself a disservice. The more I let myself be me, I let others be themselves.
I wonder if there's like a specific instinct, and maybe perhaps it's fear that forces us to believe maybe we need to cover. Is it that what are they going to think? What are they going to say? Is that fear? Is that being neurotic? Is that being paranoid? What is that?
Let's not confuse civilized behavior with what we're trying to talk about. So if we all had to meet the Queen today, we would have to behave in a certain way, hopefully, because there's a certain decorum that's required. My concern about covering it is not, are we trying to appease the culture that we're in, as much as are we suppressing a base part of self? So that we're robbing ourselves of the authenticity of our core values, and as Ronnie said earlier, our core identity. And I think that's what we're trying to say. And I think to be civilized, as Ajit said so accurately, civilization is the suppression of base emotion. So if I get into an altercation with someone, I want to use words, I want to smile, I want to talk so that I can work it out. And I think what we're trying to address here is perhaps the unnecessary erasing of self to try and fit into a situation where maybe if you didn't erase yourself, it would be okay.
Why people cover?
Mm-hmm.
It's to ensure safety, stability at work, and they're trying to avoid conflict, and
Yes.
they keep their jobs. For a lot of them, it's just a dollar bill.
Mm-hmm.
I have here the Deloitte research, and it says 83% of the LGBTQ community covers, 79% of Blacks, 67% of women, 63% of Hispanics, and 45% of straight white men cover. They all cover different things. But everybody covers. Yeah. So I have to almost cover empathy under my company in business and financial strategies, and I would deploy an empathy strategy almost covered. Think about that statement that I'm making, right?
Mm-hmm.
And today I flex on empathy like never before, but I, just like all of us, had to, like that. I had to cover, right? And it's shown that organizations that do help develop that allyship and uncover their organization have more profitability, have more innovation, and they're growing.
So let's speak to that a little bit. Like, what are the ramifications of covering? Are we limiting? Are we suppressing our creativity? What is the conversation around that?
We all have a limited amount of energy on a given day. If we're covering on a daily basis over years and then let's say decades in the workplace, there's a certain amount of energy you're putting towards covering that you're not putting towards productivity and creativity and thinking outside the box and proposing solutions, because a portion of your mind is putting energy on not saying the wrong thing, not being the person who sticks out.
Subconsciously using your energy.
So consciously using that part of your energy, where a portion is then going to your productivity, not all of it.
Okay.
Right? So let's say, like Ajit said, it doesn't have to be 100%, because we will probably all cover in some way, shape, or form throughout our lives, no matter where we work, no matter
Absolutely
who the family is, right? So let's say we took that, let's say it's 50-50, just to say, or 60-40. Even if you upped it 20% across 100 employees, 500 employees, thousands of employees, right? Of just feeling more comfortable not having to spend time and focus and energy on the covering can really boost so much, right? And how people feel and how people produce and how people show up in the room, right? So I think, yeah, I think that those are the ramifications on a daily basis, I feel, yeah.
Now for me, because I run a therapy practice, a psychiatry practice, 100% of the people I see are covering. Because there's still a huge stigma about mental illness in our culture. And I'm probably in my lifetime that won't change that much. So people don't say voluntarily necessarily in the workplace, I'm struggling with burnout or depression or anxiety. And I think that I'm very used to working with a population of people who are often ashamed. And my strategy is empathy. This I create a space of tolerance. So their story that includes their emotional issues, but also includes the rest of them, is safe to be told in my office. And if I can create a sense of safety by a place of tolerance and empathy, they can begin to realize there might be other people in their lives around them. And this has happened thousands of times where someone has said, I spoke to my husband finally about what I'm going through, or I shared it with a friend. And suddenly the community now is becoming a support for that person instead of them feeling that they're covering and hiding.
For about maybe 12 to 14 years, I've been in the corporate world in finance, working up the ladder. And that security, that resume, that whole persona of having that career trajectory and moving up the ladder and being able to have the privilege and blessing, live a certain way, to travel a certain way, and have certain contacts and networking connections that I've built, has built this identity for me that over the years I didn't realize until I started self-reflecting. It's really pushed aside a lot of my creativity and the things that I might want to do, because I feel like it strays away so much from that persona of a life, of who I am, right? So I started experimenting on LinkedIn by sharing some of my thoughts, last year. But for like 2 years, I was afraid to do it because I'm like, that's not who everyone knows me as.
Mm.
It's not Ronnie Gyani, right? Ronnie Gyani is the financial professional out there crushing it, doing deals, succeeding, right? And that's what he does. That's who he is. And it wasn't until months and months and months of just like battling it with that covering in my mind of like, do I want that regret in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, that I didn't actually share who I really was at that point and who I was becoming and who I wanted to be, right? And the last thing I'll say on that is like, that then led me to realize that I actually probably want to leave this career and go completely outside of what I've done, to explore many new opportunities. And that had a lot of covering of like, what would people think of what Ronnie has done and left the corporate world and is doing all these different things now. And the timing is crazy. I'm actually planning on putting in my resignation next week. So it's been a lot of covering, self-awareness. This has been a real wild journey of, I would say self-awareness, but really it's acknowledging that covering and acting on it.
Or uncovering.
Uncovering.
You're uncovering.
Totally. However you want to describe it.
We know people cover all the time. And you've mentioned it's difficult. We can see that and we can hear that. But how are people to uncover? What if they don't feel like they have the strength? Like, what is the process, or what are the kind of key discoveries or self-discoveries you need to recognize in order to start uncovering?
You have to find empathy for yourself, in my opinion. That was part of my self-discovery, for yourself. Because everything that, whether I want to accept it or not, about leaving the job and starting new things and going outside of my comfort zone, it's about what other people are going to think.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We need to sometimes put ourselves in our own shoes and say, what are you going to think in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years about yourself if you don't act on this? And stop thinking about what other people, whether it be friends, family, networking contacts, buddies, neighbors, even neighbors, right? It's not about them. It's about you and what you're here to serve and who you're here to serve. But we get so caught up in the covering, right? What will they think of me? Who will I be in this world? When really you are who you are, and it's not about what people think. The 4 words that so many people cannot live with not answering properly. What do you do? What do you do?
What defines you, what confines you, and what refines you. And sometimes we define ourselves a certain way. And as you said, eventually that can become, that's great. And then it becomes a bit of a prison. It confines you.
Yeah.
And we always have to refine ourselves so that we're moving towards version whatever you're up to by now. One reason why people might be covering, I think, is that they want to find a good, comfortable definition for themselves. It might become a bit of a prison. And then they reach that crossroads where they say, wait a minute, I need to refine and refine myself.
Covering is a hidden assault on our civil rights. Think about this statement. Covering is a way you bypass laws, uncovering our workforce, uncovering us as we educate ourselves. You educate your families, you educate people about the culture. The next thing is you challenge your assumptions. Next, create spaces for powerful storytelling within organizations. And the last thing is respect, okay? Is the respect that we can show up with.
Is it possible that there is a healthy threshold or amount of covering that one can do? I mean, even looking at your experience, Ronnie, you obviously had a successful career covering. If you weren't covering, do you feel that you would have had the drive to get to where you were? Or what about when you think about some of the experiences you had uncovered, and I can reflect on some of mine, I didn't have the best experiences. So in order to protect myself, I actually feel like covering in certain situations has done me better than the experience or the negative emotions that I've had to carry when I've had bad experiences. I don't look like a person with a disability, but I have and have had a quite debilitating disability for the last 8 years of my life. And during that time, I've maintained full-time work and climbed the corporate ladder, and I've always covered that religiously to a T as much as physically possible. And there's been a few times, most times when I've let someone into that part of my life, I've been told, wow, well, you look incredible. It can't be true. It's not realistic. Or people educating me on my condition. And it's never really left me feeling that good about sharing my story. So that has been one part of my personal life where I've been really strategic in how I cover that. So I would argue that covering that in certain situations has protected me mentally, physically, emotionally. But maybe that's a corrupt way of thinking because I haven't ever fully uncovered.
I work in an extremely confidential world. And I think that there's reasons why people have to have confidence and confidentiality. We cannot confuse covering with confidentiality. And so if someone has a condition, especially in my field, a mental condition, I will tell some of my clients to not go into the office and make a platform of their mental illness, because that might be the last day they work. So that's confidentiality. People are allowed to their privacy. I hope that what we're talking about is something that it's not about necessarily confidentiality out of necessity, especially medical issues, as much as what issues around core identity that you will not feel ashamed if everyone in the office is talking about later on, and that you can grow into that. When I came to my town with my wife years and years ago, there wasn't one Asian restaurant in town. And now half the restaurants are Asian and everyone likes spicy food. So the palate for tolerance can change over time.
What are the possible long-term effects of extended covering? Is it possible that you could almost forget who you once were, or you get so caught up in covering that you're not able to get out of it?
I think some of the long-term effects, unfortunately, that I've seen is people leading to drugs and alcohol. Because they're so stuck in that identity and letting it go, or just uncovering what they've been covering, that they need an escape.
Ronnie, you're very astute in saying that, but the worst long-term effect of covering is suicide.
Yes.
Where somebody can no longer tolerate maybe the false world they're living. They don't want anyone to find out, and so they can't face the world. So it can be very, very grave.
So covering for me means that there is less creativity and there is less innovation in the company. And when you have less innovation, you have less communication. Because if you and I are talking, Emily, and I'm not able to freely present my ideas with my broken accent, or with an accent, or with a perspective that comes, let's say I'm an Army vet, and I'm able to come from that perspective. But a lot of times people don't bring that up, because if they say that, then all of a sudden they're like, is this company going to hold that against me, that I may have some sort of PTSD, right?
Mm-hmm.
So think about a place that allows us to completely show up uncovered, and in a civil way. It is uncomfortable, this process of talking about covering and uncovering, because you realize it's very reflective. Back to what Ronnie said, it really reminds you, who am I? Really, who am I, right? So when you can get those values right? So think about this, Emily. When you know your values, your personal values, and then you have your values that you show up at your work with, if there's a disconnect, your fullest self is not showing up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I found that the hardest parts of uncovering myself and what I want to do going forward, or what I enjoy outside of just the day job, was the fact that I had no examples of any colleagues on my level, let's say, or above, who were doing the things that I wanted to do. For example, having your own website, posting on LinkedIn, having a blog, starting a podcast. All four of these things, I had this driving inner passion to do, but I was like, but nobody, not one colleague, and we're in 10 countries in my company, could I think of that's like, oh, well, he does that, right? Because I think the majority of them are covering. And they're not going to post something on a professional network on LinkedIn sharing their thoughts that everyone can then judge, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I basically told myself, like, I can't live in that fear. I'm going to start, the way I do this, I'm going to start the website, I'm going to start the blog, I'm going to post on LinkedIn, I'm going to start the podcast. And if I don't do it, I'm going to live in that regret. And one by one, I started doing it, and I started realizing no one showed up at the door. I didn't get the letter saying, you're being let go, here's your package. I didn't get people showing up at my door saying, are you okay? Do you need to see somebody? Like, this will lead to you losing your job, your family, your everything, because this is not what we do here, right? And I just kept doing the opposite. And that uncovering for yourself is so important to do. And whoever listens to this, hears this, reads about this, I can't tell you how fulfilling it is to actually do it and realize it's not what you thought it was going to be.
So, it's LGBTQ plus month. And how can you be an ally for that community this month? What have you done to learn more, listen more, understand more? Can you get involved in some storytelling? Can you get a little more vulnerable and share your story? And perhaps that can include and give courage to somebody else to share their story. My challenge to anybody watching this is, what kind of workplace are you creating right now that will allow for the whole selves to show up at your workplace, which will create growth for you?
I just think that if we can take anything, it's just take baby steps. There's no recipe as how to uncover, and you have to recognize yourself, take the time for yourself, be self-empathetic, as Ronnie mentioned, and slowly at your own pace start to uncover. And I think that's the only way to really recognize that maybe it's not as scary as you've dreamt it up to be.
I agree, Emily. I think if we take our time, are patient and tolerant, and of course empathic, we can uncover covering safely for the people who are hiding in the deepest places, and make the experience for all of us safer, calmer, and more compassionate. Thank you very much for First Name Basis, and today our special guests, Ronnie, Ajit, and Emily. We'll see you next time.